What you're about to see comes from parts of human history that never settled into clear answers. Across this documentary, we explore cities that were abandoned without war, structures built thousands of years earlier than expected, tombs sealed before anyone was buried, and knowledge that vanished not by accident, but by choice. These are real places, real discoveries, and real questions that modern technology still cannot fully explain. This is not about rewriting history, but about standing at the edge of what we still don't understand. Let's begin. Wherever you're watching from, and whatever time it is for you right now, a burial that erased its own location. Some burials are hidden by time. Others are lost through neglect, destruction, or accident. But there is one burial in human history that appears to have been designed from the very beginning to erase itself completely. No marker, no monument, no written record pointing to a place, only a vast landscape and a silence that has lasted for more than 8 centuries. This is the burial of Genghis Khan, and it may be the most deliberately concealed tomb ever created. Genghis Khan was not a minor ruler whose resting place was forgotten by chance. He was the founder of the Mongol Empire, a force that reshaped Eurasia more dramatically than almost any empire before or since. His armies moved faster than anyone believed possible. His influence stretched from China to Eastern Europe, and his name alone was enough to change the fate of entire cities. And yet, when he died in 1227, the greatest conqueror of his age disappeared without a trace. No confirmed tomb has ever been found. No burial chamber, no grave goods, no monument. This absence is not a failure of archaeology. It is the result of intent. Historical accounts suggest that Genghis Khan demanded secrecy in death as absolute as his authority in life. According to Mongol tradition, his burial location was to be known by no one outside those directly involved, and even they were not meant to survive with the knowledge intact. Stories passed down through generations describe a funeral procession that killed anyone who encountered it, soldiers who executed the burial party afterward, and horses driven repeatedly over the site to erase all visible traces. Whether every detail of these accounts is literal or symbolic, the outcome is undeniable. The location vanished. Unlike the monumental burials of Egypt, Mesopotamia, or China, the burial of Genghis Khan rejected permanence. It rejected stone, inscription, and visibility. This alone makes it extraordinary. Powerful rulers usually build their legacy into the landscape. Genghis Khan did the opposite. To understand why, we must understand Mongol worldview. The Mongols were nomadic. Their identity was tied to movement, not settlement. Power came from control of people and routes, not cities and monuments. The steppe itself was sacred, alive, and indifferent to human attempts at permanence. To mark a grave permanently would have been to claim ownership of land that was meant to remain free. In this context, anonymity was not weakness, it was authority. Genghis Khan's power did not need a tomb to preserve it. His legacy lived in law, lineage, and memory. A hidden burial ensured that no rival could claim symbolic ownership over his body, and no future ruler could manipulate his remains for legitimacy. This decision also protected his body from desecration. In a world of shifting alliances and endless conflict, a visible tomb would have been a target. Erasing its location ensured that even enemies who conquered Mongol lands could never conquer the body of the man who created them. The likely burial region is believed to be somewhere in northeastern Mongolia, possibly near Burkhan Khaldun, a mountain considered sacred by Genghis Khan himself. This region is vast, remote, and largely unchanged since the 13th century. It is a landscape of rolling hills, forest, rivers, and steppe, with no obvious markers to guide excavation. Even modern technology struggles here. Satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, drones, and remote sensing have all been used to search for anomalies. Some promising sites have been identified, but none confirmed. The terrain is too large, too natural, and too intentionally unmarked. There's also a cultural barrier. Many Mongolians believe the tomb should remain undiscovered. To disturb it would violate tradition, disrupt spiritual balance, and dishonor the very philosophy Genghis Khan lived by. As a result, large-scale excavation is politically and culturally sensitive, even today. This makes the burial not just hidden, but protected by belief. What makes this burial especially unsettling is how completely it succeeded. Most lost tombs leave fragments behind, robbed chambers, scattered artifacts, reused stone. Genghis Khan's burial left nothing. It did not decay into obscurity. It was erased at birth. From an archaeological perspective, this challenges everything we rely on. Archaeology depends on remains, markers, disturbance, and accumulation. This burial was designed to deny all of that. It was a one-time act meant to blend perfectly back into the living landscape. The earth itself became the monument. This forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Some ancient societies were fully capable of hiding things forever, if that was their goal. The absence of evidence does not always mean loss. Sometimes it means success. Genghis Khan's burial also raises deeper questions about how power relates to memory. Most rulers seek immortality through visibility. Genghis Khan achieved it through invisibility. His name survived without a tomb. His empire survived without a monument. His burial became more powerful by not being found. Even today, the mystery shapes his legacy. The search for the tomb has become a story in itself, blending history, archaeology, politics, and myth. But every failed search reinforces the same conclusion. This burial was not meant to be discovered, and it was executed with absolute discipline. As the opening chapter in this series, this burial sets the tone for everything that follows. It reminds us that mystery is not always accidental. Sometimes it is engineered, sometimes it is enforced, and sometimes it outlasts every tool we invent to undo it. The greatest conqueror in history did not build a tomb to be remembered. He built a silence that could not be broken, and more than 800 years later, that silence is still intact. The underground city that was never recorded. In eastern China, beneath quiet farmland and ordinary villages, there is an underground world that should not exist. Not because it is impossible to carve rock, but because of what this place represents. Scale without record, labor without history, and engineering without explanation. These are the Longyu Caves, and they stand as one of the strangest absences in all of archaeology. The caves were not discovered by archaeologists. They were discovered by farmers. In 1992, local villagers in Zhejiang province decided to drain a pond that had always been assumed to be natural and bottomless. When the water level finally dropped, it revealed something no one expected: stone walls, carved steps, and a vast man-made chamber hidden beneath the surface. As more ponds were drained, the pattern repeated. One by one, enormous underground caverns emerged, each carved deliberately into solid rock. By the time exploration began in earnest, at least 24 massive caves had been identified. What immediately troubled researchers was not just their size, but their silence in history. China possesses one of the most continuous and detailed historical records on Earth. Dynasties documented taxes, labor projects, floods, harvests, wars, and even minor regional works. And yet, nowhere, not in imperial archives, local records, inscriptions, or oral tradition, is there any mention of the Longyu Caves. Nothing. This absence is not minor. It is impossible to ignore. Each cave is enormous, some covering more than 1,000 square meters, with ceilings rising as high as 30 meters. The walls are carved at precise angles, and every surface is marked with uniform, parallel chisel lines that run diagonally across the stone. These marks are consistent across all caves, suggesting a standardized method and coordinated workforce. This was not random excavation. This was planned architecture. The caves are not natural formations. There is no evidence of collapse, erosion, or water shaping. The pillars inside are intentionally left in place to support ceilings, demonstrating a clear understanding of structural load and rock behavior. Removing this much stone without collapse requires planning, experience, and confidence. Estimates suggest that nearly 1 million cubic meters of rock were removed to create the known caves. This represents an enormous labor investment, likely involving thousands of workers over many years. And yet, no one wrote it down. This is where the mystery deepens. Large-scale projects in ancient China were never undocumented. Even unpopular emperors recorded their failures. Massive construction meant mobilization, taxation, food supply, administration, and oversight. Such projects leave paper trails. The Longyu Caves left none. There are no tool remains found inside the caves. No construction debris, no discarded equipment. The floors are clean. The chambers are empty. There are no signs of habitation, storage, burial. or ritual use. They were not quarries because the stone removed was never found reused nearby in comparable quantities. The question becomes unavoidable. Why would a civilization capable of such organization build something so massive and then leave no explanation for it? Some researchers have proposed that the caves were built during the Warring States period, or early Qin or Han dynasties, but this is speculation based on tool mark appearance alone. No inscriptions confirm it. No dating is definitive. The caves themselves refuse to anchor to a timeline. Even more puzzling is their consistency. Each cave follows similar design principles, but no two are identical. This suggests a master plan with local variation, not trial and error construction. The diagonal chisel marks are especially strange. They serve no structural purpose. They do not strengthen the walls. They do not appear decorative. And yet, they are applied uniformly, even in areas that would never be seen or used. This implies intention beyond necessity. One possibility is that the caves had a symbolic or ceremonial function that we no longer understand. Another is that they were part of a larger complex, only partially discovered. But even if that were the case, silence in the records remains unexplained. Another theory suggests the caves were created to control water, manage floods, or store resources. But there is no evidence of channels, drainage systems, or storage modifications. The caves do not interact with the water table in a practical way. They were sealed and stable long before modern discovery. Some suggest military use, but the caves lack defensive features, barracks, or strategic positioning. They are not connected to known fortifications. Others suggest they were royal projects, but royal projects are the most documented of all. The more explanations are proposed, the more the silence grows louder. Standing inside the Longyu caves today is a disorienting experience. The chambers feel intentional, not abandoned. The symmetry is controlled. The scale is confident. This doesn't feel like a forgotten failure or a halted experiment. It feels complete, which raises another disturbing possibility. What if the caves were never meant to be remembered? In some cultures, secrecy itself is power. Projects tied to taboo knowledge, sacred practice, or political instability may have been deliberately erased from official history. Records could be destroyed, mentions suppressed, knowledge restricted to a small group. If that happened here, it worked perfectly. The Longyu caves are not ruined. They are not damaged. They are not looted. They are simply empty, sealed in time, waiting beneath the ground as if paused. From a human perspective, this challenges our trust in written history. We often believe that what is not recorded did not happen. The Longyu caves prove the opposite. Something enormous happened here, and history chose not to speak about it. This makes the caves unsettling in a quiet way. They do not demand attention like pyramids or walls. They reveal themselves only when disturbed, and when they do, they offer no explanation, no inscription, no voice, just stone, scale, and absence. As the second chapter in this series, the Longyu caves expand the mystery beyond hidden burials into hidden labor. They force us to consider that entire projects, involving thousands of people, can vanish from memory if conditions allow. The underground city that was never recorded is not a failure of archaeology. It is evidence of how selective history can be. And as long as these caves remain beneath the Chinese landscape, carved with care and left without explanation, they stand as a reminder that the past is not only what we remember, it is also what was deliberately forgotten. The giant bones that vanished from science. In the late 19th century, archaeology was still young, and the rules of what could and could not exist in human history were far less rigid than they would later become. Excavations were uncovering unexpected artifacts, ancient tools, and unfamiliar fossils at a pace that often outstripped explanation. It was during this period, in southern France, that a discovery emerged which should have forced a fundamental rethinking of human history. Instead, it quietly disappeared. The story begins in 1890, near the village of Castelnau-le-Lys, where workers were excavating sediment layers believed to date back to the Miocene period, millions of years older than any accepted human presence in Europe. Within these layers, bones were uncovered that did not match any known animal species. They appeared human, but they were far too large. The bones were reportedly examined by Georges Vacher de la Puge, and later by other scholars of the time. Measurements taken from femur fragments, humerus bones, and jaw sections suggested an individual far taller than any modern human. Estimates range from over 7 feet to possibly more than 10 feet in height, depending on reconstruction assumptions. This alone should have caused controversy, but what made the discovery truly unsettling was the context. These bones were not found in shallow soil or mixed layers. They were reportedly embedded deep within geological strata that predated known human evolution by millions of years. If the dating was correct, then either the bones were misplaced, misidentified, or human history was far older and stranger than anyone was prepared to accept. At the time, the bones were not dismissed immediately. They were documented. Measurements were recorded. Illustrations were made. Reports were published in scientific bulletins and academic journals. This was not folklore. It was formal scientific communication. And then, slowly, the discussion stopped. The bones were never displayed publicly in a major museum. They were never re-examined with advancing technology. They were not incorporated into evolving models of human evolution. Instead, references to them faded from textbooks, then from academic discussion, and finally from memory. The bones did not just become controversial, they became invisible. This disappearance raises uncomfortable questions about how science handles anomalies. In theory, science is driven by evidence, not expectation. In practice, evidence that conflicts too strongly with established frameworks often finds itself sidelined. The Castelnau bones challenged multiple pillars at once. They implied extreme human size variation, questioned the accepted timeline of human emergence, and blurred the line between human and pre-human species. Addressing them properly would have required rewriting entire chapters of evolutionary theory. That did not happen. Instead, alternative explanations were quietly suggested. Some proposed the bones belonged to extinct large apes, though no known ape anatomy matches the reported measurements precisely. Others suggested misinterpretation or exaggeration, despite the original measurements being taken by trained scientists. Yet these explanations were never conclusively demonstrated. They were assumed. The most troubling aspect is the physical absence of the bones today. No confirmed repository holds them. No museum inventory lists them. No reanalysis has ever been performed. The original material appears to be lost. In science, loss of material is not unheard of. Fires, wars, and poor archival practices have destroyed countless specimens. But the timing here is notable. As evolutionary theory became more formalized and rigid in the early 20th century, anomalous finds like Castelnau quietly stopped being discussed. This pattern is not unique. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, reports of unusually large human skeletons appeared in newspapers, excavation notes, and early anthropological records across Europe, North America, and Asia. Many were poorly documented. Some were exaggerated, but not all of them. What makes Castelnau different is its scientific context. This was not a newspaper story. It was an academic report tied to geological layers far older than any accepted human remains. The disappearance of the bones leaves us with a problem. Without physical material, modern science cannot test, verify, or falsify the original claims. The evidence is frozen in old texts and illustrations, trapped between belief and dismissal. From a human perspective, this is deeply revealing. Science is not just a method, it is a culture. And cultures, even scientific ones, are shaped by consensus, authority, and acceptable boundaries. Discoveries that fall too far outside those boundaries can be ignored not because they are proven false, but because they are inconvenient. This does not mean the Castelnau giants were real in the way mythology imagines giants. It means something unusual was found, taken seriously enough to be documented, and then removed from the conversation without resolution. The bones vanished, but the questions did not. Standing back, we are forced to ask what science does when it encounters evidence it cannot place. Does it expand its models, or does it wait until the evidence disappears? In the case of Castelnau, it appears to have waited. This chapter is not about proving the existence of giants. It is about understanding how knowledge is filtered. The past we study is not just shaped by what survived in the ground, but by what survived in archives, museums, and institutional memory. If the bones had been small, they would have fit. Because they were large, they vanished. As this chapter closes, the Castelnau discovery stands as a reminder that archaeology does not only uncover ancient mysteries, it also reveals modern ones about credibility, authority, and the quiet disappearance of inconvenient evidence. The bones are gone. The reports remain, and between them lies a silence that science has never fully explained. Stones so heavy, even modern cranes fail. In the Bekaa Valley of modern-day Lebanon, there is a stone platform that immediately changes how people think about ancient construction. It is not because the site is ruined or mysterious in appearance, but because the scale of what remains challenges even modern engineering logic. This place is Baalbek, and embedded within its foundation are some of the largest stones ever moved by human beings. These stones are not legends, and they are not estimates based on exaggeration. They are measured, documented, and still in place. The most famous of these stones are known as the trilithon blocks. Each one weighs approximately 800 to 1,000 tons, depending on the estimate. To put that into perspective, even today, lifting and precisely placing stones of this weight would require custom-built cranes, reinforced ground, and carefully engineered logistics. Yet these stones were quarried, transported, lifted, and set with extraordinary accuracy nearly 2,000 years ago, possibly earlier. Baalbek is often associated with Roman construction because of the visible Roman temples that stand above the platform. However, the foundation itself tells a different story. The trilithon stones are not typical Roman masonry. They are vastly larger than what Romans used elsewhere, and they are set into a platform that appears to predate the visible Roman structures. This distinction matters. Romans were excellent engineers, but they were also practical. They preferred repeatable methods, standardized materials, and proven limits. The trilithon blocks exceed those limits by a wide margin. There is no clear Roman precedent for handling stones of this scale, and no Roman texts describe methods capable of doing so. The stones are cut with remarkable precision, their faces are flat, their edges clean, and their placement so accurate that gaps between them are minimal despite their enormous mass. These blocks are not simply stacked. They are lined, leveled, and integrated into a structural system designed to carry weight evenly. The quarry where these stones originated lies nearby, and it adds another layer to the puzzle. In the quarry rests the so-called Stone of the Pregnant Woman, weighing over 1,000 tons, along with even larger unfinished blocks discovered more recently. These stones were cut almost completely free from the bedrock, but never moved. This tells us something important. The builders were capable of quarrying stones of extreme size. The limitation was not cutting them. The limitation was transporting and placing them. At some point, the stones became too large, even for the system the builders had. This implies experimentation at a massive scale. The trilithon blocks that were moved represent the upper limit of what the builders could manage successfully. Anything larger may have exceeded their capacity. This does not suggest recklessness. It suggests confidence based on experience. One of the most difficult questions surrounding Baalbek is not lifting, but control. Moving a stone weighing hundreds of tons is one problem. Placing it precisely into a raised platform without modern leveling instruments is another entirely. Precision at this scale requires understanding load distribution, friction, and incremental movement. The builders of Baalbek were not guessing. Modern experiments using rollers, sledges, and manpower can move heavy stones, but they struggle with control at this scale. Even small errors would result in catastrophic failure. And yet, the trilithon stones sit perfectly aligned, supporting structures above them without visible stress fractures. Another unresolved issue is elevation. The stones are not placed at ground level. They are set several meters above the surrounding terrain. This means the builders had to raise them, not merely drag them horizontally. Ramps are often proposed as the solution, but ramps capable of handling stones this heavy would themselves require enormous amounts of material, space, and reinforcement. There is no clear evidence such ramps existed at the necessary scale. Even if ramps were used, the question of stability remains. Stone of this weight does not forgive mistakes. Once it begins to slip or tilt, control is lost. And yet, control was maintained. This is where Baalbek becomes more than a curiosity. It becomes a challenge to assumptions about ancient capability. Not because ancient people lacked intelligence, but because modern explanations often underestimate the sophistication of ancient planning and organization. The builders of Baalbek likely relied on methods that combine mechanical advantage, surface preparation, and incremental movement far more advanced than simple brute force. They may have used systems involving counterweights, levers, compacted pathways, and carefully timed movements coordinated across large teams. What is missing is not intelligence. What is missing is documentation. No inscriptions describe the construction process. No texts explain how these stones were moved. The platform appears suddenly in the archaeological record, fully realized, without clear developmental stages leading up to it. This pattern should sound familiar. Like Ollantaytambo, like the granite scoop marks, Baalbek presents finished mastery without visible trial and error. The builders did not leave behind half-failed attempts at smaller scales. They appear to have arrived already knowing what was possible. The Roman temples built above the platform reused the foundation, which suggests the Romans themselves respected it. They did not dismantle it. They did not replace it. They built on top of it, accepting it as something beyond improvement. That choice alone is telling. If the Romans could have replicated or surpassed the platform, they likely would have. Instead, they adapted to it. Standing at Baalbek today, the stones do not feel theatrical. They feel functional, deliberate, and conservative. Nothing about them suggests excess for show. The size appears chosen because it served a structural purpose, not because it impressed observers. That raises a deeper question. Why did the builders feel the need to use stones this large at all? Smaller blocks could have done the job. The decision to use megaliths suggests a belief that size itself provided stability, permanence, or resistance to forces the builders anticipated. Earthquakes, erosion, or subsidence may have influenced their choices. If so, the builders were thinking far ahead. The trilithon blocks have survived earthquakes, wars, and centuries of weather with minimal displacement. Their mass makes them resistant to movement. Their precision distributes stress evenly. The design worked. Modern cranes struggle with stones of this size not because modern engineers are incapable, but because our systems are optimized differently. We rely on machines rather than mass coordination, and our machines have limits. Ancient builders relied on planning, physics, and time. Baalbek forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. There are things ancient people accomplished that we do not fully understand, not because they were impossible, but because their methods were not preserved. As this chapter closes, Baalbek stands not as evidence of lost magic or fantasy, but as evidence of lost engineering traditions. Knowledge that was once practical, repeatable, and reliable disappeared when the societies that maintained it changed. The stones remain where they were placed, indifferent to explanation. They do not ask to be believed. They only ask to be measured. And when they are, they continue to raise the same quiet question that echoes across ancient sites worldwide. How much human knowledge has already been lost, simply because no one thought it needed to be written down? The book written by one hand, over a lifetime. There are books that preserve stories, and there are books that become mysteries themselves. The Codex Gigas belongs firmly in the second category. It is not mysterious because of what it says, but because of what it is. Its size, its consistency, and the conditions required to create it push the limits of what a single human life can realistically accomplish. For centuries, this manuscript has raised a quiet but persistent question that no legend can fully answer. How could one person have written this entire book, alone, by hand, over a lifetime? The Codex Gigas is often called the Devil's Bible, a nickname that distracts from the real mystery. The devil illustration inside the book is striking, but it is not the problem. The problem is scale. The book measures nearly a meter tall when open and weighs around 75 kilograms. It contains over 300 parchment pages, each made from animal skin, each filled with dense, carefully executed script. This is not casual writing. The manuscript includes the entire Latin Bible, along with historical texts, medical knowledge, calendars, legal material, and encyclopedic information known at the time. It is not a fragmented work. It is structured, deliberate, and coherent. And throughout the entire book, the handwriting remains remarkably consistent. Modern analysis has shown that the same hand appears on every page. This single detail changes everything. Handwriting is not static. Over time, people age. Their muscles weaken, their grip changes, their writing drifts. Yet, in the Codex Gigas, letter forms remain uniform from beginning to end. The spacing, pressure, proportions, and rhythm of the script show no clear signs of generational change. This implies that the manuscript was written by one person within a single lifetime, without long interruptions. That alone is extraordinary. To understand what this means, we have to consider the physical process. Writing by hand on parchment is slow. Ink must be prepared carefully. Parchment resists the pen differently than paper. Errors cannot be erased easily. Each page demands concentration, control, and patience. Now multiply that effort by hundreds of pages. Scholars have estimated that writing the Codex Gigas would have taken at least 20 to 30 years of full-time labor, assuming the scribe worked nearly every day. This estimate does not include preparing parchment, ruling lines, mixing ink, or binding the book. It only accounts for writing. This raises immediate problems. Monastic scribes rarely worked on a single manuscript exclusively for decades. They copied texts as part of communal labor. They were interrupted by prayer, illness, travel, and other duties. And yet, the Codex Gigas shows no shift in style that would suggest multiple scribes or long breaks. The work feels uninterrupted. The consistency of the script suggests discipline at an almost inhuman level. The scribe maintained focus, posture, technique, and visual standards over an immense span of time. There's no evidence of decline, fatigue, or stylistic evolution. This does not align easily with normal human behavior. The legend attached to the Codex Gigas attempts to explain this difficulty. According to the story, a monk condemned to severe punishment promised to write a book containing all human knowledge in a single night, and when he realized the task was impossible, he made a pact with the devil to complete it. The illustration of the devil appears opposite an image of heaven, reinforcing the myth, but legends exist to fill gaps where understanding fails. The real mystery is not supernatural. It is physiological and psychological. How did one person maintain such consistency for so long? How did they avoid injury, exhaustion, or variation? Writing by hand for hours each day places strain on the wrist, shoulder, neck, and eyes. Modern scribes develop repetitive strain injuries far sooner than the time required to complete a manuscript of this scale. Yet the Codex Gigas shows no sign of compromise. Another layer of mystery lies in planning. The manuscript was not assembled randomly. The texts are arranged intentionally. Space was allocated in advance. The scribe knew what would come later and planned for it. This required foresight and control over the entire project from the beginning. Mistakes in early pages could not be corrected later without disrupting the whole structure. This suggests that the scribe was not copying casually. They were executing a long-term vision with precision. The parchment itself adds to the puzzle. Producing enough parchment for the Codex Gigas would have required the skins of over 100 animals. Acquiring, preparing, and storing this material would have required institutional support. Yet the handwriting suggests a solitary author, not a team. This creates tension. The project appears to require a community, but the execution appears individual. Some scholars suggest that the consistency may be deceptive, that multiple scribes were trained to imitate one hand. But handwriting analysis has found subtle micro-features that are extremely difficult to replicate across individuals, including stroke order, pressure variation, and habitual spacing. Imitation does not fully explain it. Another possibility is that the scribe worked under highly controlled conditions, perhaps isolated, dedicating their life to the manuscript. This raises questions about motivation. Why would someone commit decades to a single book without variation or credit? The Codex Gigas contains no personal commentary, no explanation, no apology, no dedication. The scribe does not speak. That silence is unsettling. The book was not written to glorify its creator. It was written to exist. This mindset is difficult to reconstruct today. Modern creators leave signatures, names, identities. The Codex Gigas offers none. The person behind it disappears completely into the work. This level of self-erasure suggests extreme devotion, discipline, or compulsion. It may also suggest coercion. Monastic life could be harsh. Some monks were punished through isolation or assigned extreme labor as penance. Writing endlessly could be both devotion and sentence. If the scribe was confined, the consistency could reflect enforced routine rather than inspiration. But even this explanation struggles with the physical demands. There are no visible tremors, no deterioration, no lapse in quality. The hand remains steady. The book also shows no signs of haste. The ink application is careful. The margins are balanced. This was not rushed labor. It was controlled, deliberate, and patient. This contradicts the idea of desperation or fear-driven writing. Standing before the Codex Gigas today, the overwhelming feeling is not dread, but endurance. This is not a book that feels cursed. It feels heavy with time. Each page represents hours of attention that can never be recovered. The real mystery is not whether one person could have written it, but what kind of person could sustain that commitment? What mental state allows decades of repetitive precision without variation? What belief system makes that effort meaningful enough to continue? The Codex Gigas does not answer these questions. It preserves the result, not the process. From a historical perspective, this manuscript challenges our assumptions about medieval life. It suggests that individual capacity, when paired with rigid discipline and institutional support, could reach extremes rarely acknowledged. It also reminds us that not all ancient achievements are monumental in stone. Some are monumental in patience. The Codex Gigas survives wars, fires, relocation, and neglect. The person who wrote it does not survive even as a name. Their existence is reduced to handwriting. This imbalance feels intentional. As this chapter closes, the Codex Gigas stands as evidence that human limits are not always defined by tools or technology, but by endurance and belief. It shows us that some mysteries are not about how something was made, but about how long someone was willing to keep going. One hand, one book, a lifetime absorbed into ink and skin. And even now, centuries later, the manuscript remains intact, still asking the same quiet question. What kind of human disappears so completely into their work that only the work remains? The pyramid that appeared and disappeared from history. In the early 20th century, Western pilots flying over central China reported something they did not expect to see. Rising from the plains of Shanxi province, partially hidden by haze and distance, were massive pyramid-shaped structures that did not resemble anything documented in Chinese history books available to the outside world. These were not small mounds or natural hills. They were geometric, symmetrical, and unmistakably artificial. And then, just as suddenly as they entered public awareness, they vanished from global attention. For decades, references to these pyramids existed only in scattered pilot reports, blurry photographs, and secondhand accounts. Some described a white pyramid that reflected sunlight so strongly it appeared luminous from the air. Others mentioned entire fields of pyramidal mounds stretching across the landscape. Yet for much of the 20th century, official records were silent, access was restricted, and serious investigations stalled. The pyramids appeared, and then they disappeared. This mystery is not about whether ancient China built monumental tombs. That is well established. What is strange is how these structures slipped in and out of historical visibility, despite their size, their number, and their proximity to populated regions. Shanxi province is the cradle of early Chinese civilization. It was the heartland of multiple dynasties and the burial place of emperors who commanded enormous resources. Many imperial tombs in this region are pyramid-shaped mounds, often covering vast underground complexes. But for a long time, the scale of some of these structures was either underestimated or deliberately downplayed. One reason is perspective. From the ground, many Chinese pyramids look like natural hills. Over centuries, erosion, vegetation, and farming softened their edges. Trees were planted on their slopes. Soil accumulated. What was once sharply geometric became visually subtle. Without aerial observation, their true form was easy to miss. From the air, however, the geometry becomes obvious. Satellite images and aerial photographs taken in recent decades confirmed the existence of dozens of large pyramid-shaped mounds in Shanxi, some rivaling the size of Egyptian pyramids in base width, though not in height. These structures are aligned, planned, and clearly artificial. They are not isolated tombs, but part of a broader funerary landscape. The question is not whether they exist. The question is why they were so poorly acknowledged for so long. During much of the 20th century, large areas of Shanxi were restricted zones. Foreign researchers had limited access. Aerial photography was controlled. Information flow was tightly managed. In that environment, ancient structures that did not fit existing narratives could remain obscure without deliberate suppression. But obscurity alone does not explain the confusion surrounding early reports. Some accounts describe pyramids with white stone exteriors that no longer appear today. This raises the possibility that these structures were once faced with materials that were later removed, eroded, or deliberately stripped. Many ancient pyramids worldwide were originally covered in polished stone that was later quarried for other uses. If the Shanxi pyramids once had such casing, their appearance from the air would have been dramatically different from what we see now. Another possibility is exaggeration. Early pilots, unfamiliar with Chinese landscape and history, may have misjudged scale or composition, yet satellite imagery confirms that some of these mounds are immense, and their arrangement suggests careful planning rather than coincidence. The largest among them is believed to be the tomb of Emperor Qin Shi Huang, famous for the terracotta army. This pyramid-shaped mound covers a vast underground complex that remains largely unexcavated due to concerns about preservation. Ancient texts describe rivers of mercury flowing within, and modern soil analysis confirms unusually high mercury levels around the site. This alone suggests that ancient Chinese engineering reached extraordinary levels of ambition and complexity. But Qin Shi Huang's tomb is not the only one. Surrounding it are many other pyramidal mounds, belonging to emperors, nobles, and royal family members. Some are nearly as large. Others form deliberate alignments across the plain. When viewed together, they resemble a planned necropolis rather than isolated burials. Why then did these pyramids seem to vanish from public awareness? Part of the answer lies in how history is framed. Western audiences long associated pyramids almost exclusively with Egypt and Mesoamerica. Monumental burial architecture in China did not fit that familiar image. When reports surfaced, they sounded implausible, even though they were accurate. Another factor is conservation policy. Chinese authorities have often chosen preservation over excavation. Many tombs remain sealed to prevent damage. Without dramatic digs or exposed stonework, these structures remain visually understated. A sealed pyramid does not attract attention like an excavated one. There is also the issue of documentation. Chinese historical records focus more on lineage, governance, and ritual than on architectural description. Tombs were known to exist, but their external shapes were not always emphasized. Over time, the landscape absorbed them. This created a situation where enormous structures existed in plain sight, but lacked a narrative. The result was a gap between physical reality and historical awareness. What makes the Shanxi pyramids particularly interesting is that they challenge assumptions about ancient monumentality. They show that large-scale earth and stone architecture was not unique to a few civilizations, but a recurring human response to power, death, and legacy. Yet, unlike Egypt, where pyramids were meant to be seen, Chinese pyramids were meant to be hidden. Imperial philosophy emphasized harmony with the land rather than dominance over it. Tombs were integrated into natural landscapes, aligned with geomancy, mountains, rivers, and cosmic order. Visibility was not the goal. Balance was. This explains why these pyramids could exist without becoming visual icons. The disappearance from history, then, was not a single event. It was a gradual fading, caused by erosion, cultural framing, restricted access, and different values about monumentality. The pyramids never truly vanished. They simply stopped being noticed. Modern satellite imagery has brought them back into focus, but even now, many remain unexplored. Their interiors sealed, their construction methods only partially understood. What lies beneath them may remain unknown for generations. From a human perspective, this is a reminder that history is not always lost through destruction. Sometimes it's lost through quiet continuity. When something becomes part of the landscape, it stops being questioned. The Shanxi pyramids were always there. They were not erased by war. As this chapter closes, the pyramids of China stand as monuments not just to ancient emperors, but to a different relationship between power and visibility. They show us that some civilizations chose to hide their greatest constructions, trusting that the land itself would remember. And only when we looked from above, centuries later, did we realize how much had been there all along. The map that knew the world too early. In 1513, an Ottoman naval officer named Piri Reis compiled a world map that should not have been possible for its time. Not because maps did not exist, and not because cartography was primitive, but because of what this map appears to show, and how confidently it shows it. Portions of coastlines that would not be officially documented by Europeans until centuries later appear with surprising accuracy. And even more troubling, the map itself claims to be a copy of far older sources that no longer exist. The Piri Reis map is not a legend or a rumor. It is a real artifact preserved today in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. Only a fragment of the original map survives, but that fragment alone is enough to raise serious questions about how geographic knowledge was gathered, preserved, and transmitted long before the modern age of exploration. At first glance, the map appears to depict parts of Europe, Africa, and the Atlantic world. This is not unusual for the early 16th century. What becomes unusual is the level of detail in the coastlines of South America, especially Brazil, which had only recently been encountered by European explorers. The contours appear smoother, more continuous, and more informed than one would expect from early exploratory voyages. The deeper mystery, however, lies not in the coastlines alone, but in what Piri Reis himself wrote about the map. In his marginal notes, Piri Reis explains that he did not invent this map from scratch. Instead, he claims to have compiled it from at least 20 older source maps, including charts from Arab navigators, Portuguese sailors, and, most intriguingly, maps dating back to the time of Alexander the Great. He specifically references ancient sources that were already considered old in his own era. This statement cannot be dismissed casually. Piri Reis was not an outsider speculating wildly. He was a professional admiral, trained in navigation, warfare, and maritime intelligence. His career depended on accuracy. His writings elsewhere demonstrate technical competence and caution. When he states that his sources were ancient, he is not speaking metaphorically. If those sources existed, then knowledge of the world's geography may have been far more extensive at earlier periods than modern history typically acknowledges. One of the most controversial aspects of the Piri Reis map is the southern landmass depicted beneath South America. Some researchers have claimed this represents Antarctica, shown free of ice, long before Antarctica was officially discovered. Others argue it is a distorted extension of South America itself. This debate is important, but it is often misunderstood. The real issue is not whether the map perfectly shows Antarctica. The issue is why the southern coastline is drawn at all, and why it follows a coherent pattern rather than vague speculation. Early maps often included imagined lands, but those were usually exaggerated, symbolic, or fantastical. The southern land on the Piri Reis map appears measured, not imagined. The coastlines are continuous. They follow logical curvature. They align with known navigation practices. This suggests the map was not guessing. Another overlooked detail is projection. The Piri Reis map does not use the same projection systems common in medieval European maps. Its geometry suggests a spherical understanding of the Earth, not a flat or symbolic one. This implies mathematical sophistication inherited from earlier traditions. Ancient Greek scholars understood Earth's curvature. Islamic scholars preserved and expanded that knowledge. If Piri Reis had access to ancient maps from these traditions, then his work becomes less mysterious, but more unsettling. It implies continuity where history assumes loss. This brings us to the question of preservation. Maps are fragile. They decay. They burn. They are rewritten as borders change. Unlike stone monuments, cartographic knowledge is easy to erase. Entire geographic traditions can disappear within a few generations, if not continuously copied. If ancient civilizations possessed advanced cartographic knowledge, there's no guarantee it would survive intact to modern times. The Piri Reis map may represent a fragment of such a tradition. Its accuracy in some areas and distortion in others suggests copying from multiple sources of varying age and quality. This is exactly what Piri Reis describes. He did not claim perfection. He claimed compilation. That honesty matters. The map also lacks interior detail. It focuses on coastlines, ports, and navigation routes. This suggests its purpose was maritime, not imperial display. It was meant to move ships safely, not impress scholars. This again supports the idea that the sources were practical, not symbolic. Critics often argue that coincidence, guesswork, or later interpolation explain the map's accuracy. But coincidence does not explain consistency across multiple regions. Guesswork does not produce proportional coastlines. And interpolation requires a baseline of information that itself must come from somewhere. The map is not perfect, but it is not random. From a historical perspective, the most troubling aspect is not what the map shows, but what it implies about lost knowledge networks. Ancient civilizations traded extensively. They shared ideas, tools, and beliefs. There is no inherent reason why geographic knowledge would be excluded from this exchange. Sailors existed long before Columbus. Coastal navigation existed long before modern empires. The assumption that the world was unknown simply because it was undocumented in surviving European texts reflects a narrow historical lens. The Piri Reis map widens that lens. It suggests that discovery is not always the same as first contact. Sometimes it is rediscovery. When the map was rediscovered in the 20th century, it did not cause the upheaval one might expect. It was studied, debated, and ultimately absorbed into academic discussion without forcing major revision. This is partly because it exists in a gray zone. It does not clearly prove an alternative history. It only hints at one. Hints are easier to ignore than proof, yet the map remains, preserved in ink and parchment, quietly challenging assumptions. It does not claim ancient global civilization. It does not demand radical reinterpretation. It simply exists, accurately enough to be uncomfortable, vaguely enough to resist certainty. From a human perspective, this is often how real mysteries behave. They do not announce themselves loudly. They persist quietly. The Piri Reis map does not overthrow history. It questions how much of it survives. It reminds us that knowledge does not move in straight lines. It advances, fragments, disappears, and reappears. As this chapter closes, the map stands as a symbol of continuity we cannot fully trace, a reminder that the world may have been known, then forgotten, then known again. The ink remains, the sources are gone, and between them lies a gap that history has not yet closed. A monument carved from a single mountain. There are monuments that impress because of their size, and there are monuments that disturb because of how they were made. The Kailasa Temple at Ellora belongs to the second category. It does not rise from the ground stone by stone. It does not assemble itself from blocks carried in from elsewhere. Instead, it was carved downward, directly out of a solid volcanic rock cliff, until an entire temple complex emerged from what was once a single mountain. This alone sets it apart from almost every other monumental structure in human history. The Kailasa Temple is not a cave temple in the conventional sense. It is not a hollowed chamber or a carved facade. It is a fully freestanding structure, complete with courtyards, pillars, shrines, stairways, bridges, and sculptural panels, all created by removing rock rather than assembling it. Everything visible today is what was left behind after an enormous amount of stone was taken away. This reversal of construction logic is central to the mystery. Most ancient architecture allows for correction. If a block is cut incorrectly, it can be replaced. If alignment is off, adjustments can be made as the structure rises. At Kailasa, there was no such flexibility. Every cut was permanent. Every mistake would have been visible forever. The builders had to know exactly what they were creating before they began. And they began at the top. Archaeological evidence shows that the Kailasa temple was carved from the mountain downward, starting with the highest point and working gradually toward the ground. This means the entire structure had to be visualized in 3 dimensions before a single strike was made. The final form existed fully in the minds of the builders before it existed in stone. This level of planning is difficult even with modern tools. The scale of the project is staggering. Estimates suggest that over 400,000 tons of rock were removed to create the temple. There's no clear record of where this material went. It was not used to build nearby structures in comparable quantity. It simply vanished into the surrounding landscape. The temple itself stands roughly 30 meters high and extends deep into the rock face. It contains intricately carved reliefs depicting mythological scenes, deities, animals, and symbolic motifs, all executed with remarkable consistency. These carvings are not shallow decorations. They are deeply cut, structurally integrated, and aligned with architectural elements. This was not decorative carving added later. It was integral to the design from the beginning. The temple is traditionally dated to the 8th century CE, during the reign of the Rashtrakuta king Krishna. However, the dating relies primarily on inscriptions and stylistic interpretation, not on detailed construction records. No ancient text describes how the temple was carved, how long it took, or how labor was organized. This absence is striking. Large projects usually leave administrative trails. They require food supply, workforce management, scheduling, and oversight. The Kailasa temple would have required thousands of workers operating for many years, possibly decades. Yet there's no surviving documentation detailing this process. The stone itself offers clues. The rock at Ellora is basalt, a hard volcanic stone that resists cutting. Shaping it with iron tools is possible, but slow and physically exhausting. To maintain consistency across such a massive project, tool standards, sharpening methods, and carving techniques would have needed to be highly controlled. The surfaces of the Kailasa temple show smooth transitions, sharp edges, and complex curves. These are not the marks of uncoordinated labor. They suggest a unified method and shared understanding among the builders. One of the most unsettling aspects of the temple is its symmetry. Despite being carved entirely by subtraction, the structure remains balanced, aligned, and proportionate. Columns match across distances, levels align vertically, decorative elements repeat with precision. This implies continuous measurement and reference throughout the carving process. Without modern surveying equipment, maintaining such accuracy would have required an internal system of reference points and geometry applied consistently across years of work. Mistakes would have been catastrophic, yet there's no evidence of major correction or redesign. The temple does not feel experimental. It feels assured. This raises a critical question. How did the builders acquire the confidence to attempt such a project? They did not begin with something small. The Kailasa temple is not the result of incremental improvement visible on site. It appears as a fully realized concept executed in one continuous effort. This suggests prior experience with similar methods. However, no earlier example of comparable scale exists in the region. Smaller rock-cut temples exist at Ellora and elsewhere, but none approach the complexity and ambition of Kailasa. This gap is difficult to explain. Either the builders developed extraordinary expertise very quickly, or they inherited techniques from traditions that left little trace. The religious significance of the temple adds another layer. Kailasa is dedicated to Shiva and is meant to represent Mount Kailash, the cosmic mountain believed to be the dwelling of the god. The act of carving a mountain into a temple is itself symbolic. The builders were not just constructing a place of worship, they were transforming nature into cosmology. This symbolic goal may explain the decision to carve rather than build. But symbolism does not reduce technical difficulty. It amplifies it. The temple includes bridges carved from rock that span open spaces, balconies that project outward, and internal chambers that required precise weight distribution. Structural failure at any stage could have collapsed entire sections, yet the temple stands intact. Even today, modern engineers study the site with admiration and uncertainty. Replicating such a structure using hand tools, without modern machinery, would be an enormous challenge, even with full documentation. Doing so without leaving any explanation is something else entirely. There is also the human factor. Workers carving stone for years face physical strain, injury, and fatigue. Maintaining consistent quality across thousands of carvings requires not just skill, but discipline and organization. This implies a social system capable of sustaining long-term focus on a single project. That system remains invisible. No worker names survive. No master architect is identified with certainty. The temple exists without personal attribution, as if the individual identities involved were less important than the act itself. This anonymity echoes patterns seen elsewhere in ancient monumental construction. From a modern perspective, the Kailasa temple challenges our assumptions about ancient limits. It forces us to reconsider how planning, labor, and belief interacted. It shows that ancient builders were capable of thinking not just in structures, but in volumes of absence, carving space itself as a design element. The temple is not impressive because it is large. It is unsettling because it is subtractive. Everything we see is what the builders chose to leave behind. As this chapter closes, the Kailasa temple stands as one of the most extreme examples of human commitment to an idea. It was not assembled, it was revealed. A mountain was reshaped into meaning through patience, precision, and belief. And once completed, it required no explanation. The stone speaks for itself. Objects the Romans never wrote about. The Roman Empire documented almost everything. Laws, military campaigns, engineering methods, religious rituals, trade goods, household tools, and even mundane administrative details were recorded in stone, parchment, and metal. Roman writers describe bridges, roads, aqueducts, weapons, calendars, and farming equipment with extraordinary precision. And yet, scattered across the former territory of the Roman Empire, archaeologists continue to find an object that the Romans themselves never mentioned even once. These objects are known today as Roman dodecahedrons. They are small, hollow artifacts made primarily of bronze, shaped with 12 flat faces, each face pierced by a circular hole of varying size. At each corner sits a small knob or protrusion. The craftsmanship is careful and deliberate. The geometry is precise. The objects are not decorative in a casual sense, nor are they crude or experimental. They are intentional. More than 100 Roman dodecahedrons have been discovered so far, most commonly in regions that once formed the northwestern provinces of the empire, including modern France, Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, and Britain. They are usually found in isolation, not in workshops, not in large caches, and rarely alongside other identifiable tools. And here's the central problem. No Roman text explains what they are. No inscriptions identify their purpose. No illustrations depict them in use. No manuals describe their function. For a civilization that recorded even the dimensions of nails used in construction, this silence is extraordinary. The dodecahedrons vary in size, typically between 4 and 10 centimeters in diameter. The holes on each face differ in diameter, suggesting measurement or calibration rather than decoration. The knobs at the vertices are consistent across examples, implying a standardized design rather than artistic variation. This consistency matters. Objects that serve no function tend to vary widely. Objects designed for a specific task tend to converge toward an optimal form. Roman dodecahedrons fall clearly into the second category. They were made to do something. Many theories have been proposed over the years. Some suggest they were candle holders, though no wax residue has been found. Others propose they were dice, but their shape and hole sizes make that unlikely. Some believe they were religious objects, yet they lack iconography, inscriptions, or known ritual context. One theory suggests they were measuring devices, possibly for surveying or range finding. By looking through opposite holes of different diameters, a user could estimate distance based on known object size. This idea fits the geometry and hole variation, but it raises another problem. If the Romans used them for military or engineering purposes, why were they never documented? Roman military manuals were detailed. Roman surveying texts were precise. A useful tool would not go unmentioned. Another theory proposes textile use, possibly as knitting aids or glove-making tools. This idea attempts to explain the hole sizes, but it struggles to account for the precise geometry and the effort required to cast such objects in bronze. Bronze was valuable. It was not wasted on trivial tools. There's also the geographical pattern. Dodecahedrons are found almost exclusively in the northern provinces. They are absent from Rome itself, from Italy, from Greece, and from much of the Eastern Empire. This suggests a regional use rather than an empire-wide standard. But Roman regional tools were still documented somewhere, unless the object belonged to a domain that discouraged documentation. One possibility that cannot be ignored is restricted knowledge. Certain practices in the Roman world, particularly those related to ritual, divination, or specialized guilds, were intentionally kept out of public record. Knowledge passed orally leaves little archaeological trace beyond the objects themselves. If the dodecahedrons belong to such a practice, their silence becomes understandable. Another possibility is that the objects were culturally inherited, rather than Roman in origin. The Romans were famous for adopting tools, customs, and technologies from conquered peoples. If the dodecahedron originated among Celtic or local traditions and was absorbed without formal integration, Roman writers may not have considered it worth recording. Yet this still does not explain the level of standardization. Casting a hollow bronze polyhedron with precise geometry is not simple. It requires skilled metalworkers, molds, and planning. This was not folk craftsmanship. It was professional. The fact that many dodecahedrons were found carefully placed, rather than discarded, suggests they were valued. Some were found in graves, implying personal significance. Others were found in hoards, suggesting they were preserved rather than used up. This does not align with disposable tools. What makes the mystery more unsettling is that none show clear signs of wear, consistent with mechanical use. The holes are smooth, but not abraded. The knobs are intact. This suggests controlled handling rather than rough usage. Perhaps they were used occasionally, not constantly. Perhaps they were used only at specific times. From a human perspective, this is where the discomfort begins. The Roman dodecahedrons force us to admit that even well-documented civilizations contain blind spots. Objects can survive while their meanings vanish completely. We often assume that writing guarantees understanding. The dodecahedrons prove otherwise. The Romans knew exactly what these objects were for. They did not forget. They simply never told us. Whether through cultural assumption, secrecy, or oral tradition, the knowledge remained local and temporary. When the people who used these objects disappeared, the meaning disappeared with them. Modern archaeology is left with form without context. The geometry is clear. The craftsmanship is obvious. The function is absent. This is not a failure of imagination. It is a failure of transmission. As this chapter closes, the Roman dodecahedrons remain quietly defiant. They sit in museum cases, labeled cautiously, surrounded by speculation rather than certainty. They are reminders that history does not preserve everything equally. Some objects survive because they are durable. Some meanings vanish because they are fragile. And sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are not the things that were hidden, but the things that were used openly, understood completely, and then forgotten without a trace. The Romans never wrote about these objects, and that silence may be the most important clue of all. Stones that move when no one is watching. In one of the most remote and inhospitable places in North America, there's a flat, dry lake bed where stones appear to move on their own. There are no roads nearby, no settlements, and almost no human presence for long stretches of time. Yet across the cracked surface of this ancient playa, rocks weighing up to several hundred kilograms leave long, winding trails behind them, as if they were dragged slowly across the ground by invisible hands. This is Racetrack Playa, and for decades it challenged the basic assumption that objects do not move without force we can see. The mystery is not that the stones move. The mystery is how they move when no one is there to witness it. Racetrack Playa lies within Death Valley National Park, an area defined by extreme temperature swings, powerful winds, and long periods of isolation. The playa itself is remarkably flat, formed by sediment settling evenly over thousands of years. This flatness is important because even slight slopes can influence motion. Measurements show that the surface tilts by only a few centimeters over hundreds of meters, making spontaneous rolling unlikely. And yet, the trails are unmistakable. Each moving stone leaves behind a clear track etched into the hardened mud. Some trails are straight, others curve gently. Some stones travel long distances before stopping. Others change direction mid-path, sometimes abruptly, sometimes gradually. In a few cases, stones appear to have moved together, then separated, each following a slightly different route. There are no footprints nearby, no drag marks from tools, no evidence of human interference. The trails appear after the stones move, not before, and the stones do not move continuously. They sit still for years, sometimes decades before shifting again. For much of the 20th century, scientists struggled to explain this phenomenon convincingly. Wind alone did not seem sufficient. Even strong desert gusts could not easily push stones of that mass across dry ground without tipping or flipping them. Earthquakes were proposed, but the movement patterns didn't match seismic activity. Animal activity was ruled out early. The stones were moving under conditions that did not leave witnesses. This absence of observation allowed speculation to thrive. Stories circulated of magnetic forces, underground vibrations, and even paranormal explanations. These ideas gained attention not because they were convincing, but because conventional explanations were incomplete. The challenge was not theoretical. It was practical. No one had actually seen the stones move. Researchers could measure trails, analyze sediment, and calculate forces, but without direct observation, any explanation remained tentative. The phenomenon occurred too rarely and unpredictably to capture easily. Eventually, careful long-term monitoring changed the conversation. Modern studies revealed that under very specific conditions, a combination of water, ice, wind, and surface chemistry could produce movement without dramatic force. During rare winter nights, shallow pools of water form on the playa. When temperatures drop, thin sheets of ice develop around the stones. As the sun rises, the ice begins to break into panels. These ice panels, driven by light winds, can push stones slowly across the slick mud surface beneath. The movement is subtle, the speed is slow, the force is distributed. This explains why no one noticed it happening. The stones do not slide dramatically. They creep, sometimes only centimeters per second, and only for brief periods when conditions align perfectly. The explanation is elegant, but it does not diminish the wonder. The stones still move when no one is watching. What makes Racetrack Playa compelling is not that science eventually found a mechanism, but how fragile and precise that mechanism is. Remove one element, and the movement stops. Without water, there's no ice. Without ice, the wind is insufficient. Without the specific clay composition of the playa, friction would be too high. The phenomenon depends on a delicate balance of conditions that rarely occur together. This has broader implications. Nature often operates through systems that are invisible most of the time and active only briefly. Human perception, limited by attention and scale, misses these moments. When we encounter the results without witnessing the process, mystery fills the gap. Racetrack playa teaches us that absence of observation is not absence of cause. The stones do not move often. They move quietly. They move when the landscape allows it. Even now, with cameras installed and sensors deployed, long stretches pass without activity. When movement occurs, it is understated. No sound, no sudden shift, just a gradual change in position that becomes obvious only after it's complete. Standing on the playa, surrounded by silence, the trails feel unsettling because they imply motion where stillness dominates. The human mind expects activity to leave noise, disruption, or visible effort. Here, effort is dispersed across environment rather than concentrated in action. This challenges how we think about force. Force does not always announce itself. Sometimes it accumulates, aligns, and expresses itself briefly before disappearing again. The stones become records of that moment, preserving motion long after it has ended. From a broader perspective, this phenomenon mirrors many ancient mysteries explored in this series. Structures built with no surviving instructions, objects whose purposes vanished, knowledge that operated quietly within specific conditions and then disappeared. The stones of Racetrack Playa are not defying physics. They are revealing how much physics depends on context. For decades, the lack of witnesses allowed imagination to outrun evidence. When the evidence finally arrived, it did not replace mystery with banality. It replaced it with subtlety. The stones move because the land allows them to move, and most of the time, the land does not. As this chapter closes, Racetrack Playa stands as a reminder that not all mysteries are solved by spectacle. Some are solved by patience, long observation, and the humility to accept that nature does not operate on human schedules. The stones will move again, not when we demand it, not when cameras are ready, but when water, ice, wind, and earth quietly agree. And when they do, the playa will record it once more, long after the moment itself has passed, leaving behind trails that seem impossible, until we learn how rarely the impossible is allowed to happen. A pyramid, hidden in plain sight. Sometimes history doesn't hide its greatest structures underground or behind destruction. Sometimes it hides them by letting them exist openly in familiar landscapes until people stop questioning what they are looking at. The so-called White Pyramid of China is one of those cases. It was never truly lost. It was simply absorbed into its surroundings so completely that it slipped out of global awareness for decades. The story begins not with archaeology, but with aviation. During the Second World War, Allied pilots flying supply routes over central China reported seeing enormous pyramidal structures rising from the plains of Shanxi province. One pilot described a massive white pyramid that appeared to reflect sunlight, standing out starkly against the surrounding terrain. The report sounded implausible at the time, almost mythical, and it received little serious attention outside of brief mentions in aviation accounts. And yet, the reports did not stop. Over the years, multiple sightings were described, often independently by people unfamiliar with one another. They spoke of large pyramidal mounds, some smooth-sided, some terraced, scattered across a wide area. Still, without ground access or official confirmation, the idea of Chinese pyramids remained on the edge of credibility in the Western world. What makes this situation unusual is not the existence of large imperial tombs in China. That is well documented. What's unusual is how little emphasis was placed on their external form, despite their scale. For a long time, the narrative of pyramids belonged almost exclusively to Egypt and Mesoamerica. Monumental earthworks in China did not fit that familiar framework, and so they were quietly ignored. The so-called White Pyramid is believed to be associated with the mausoleum of Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. His burial mound is enormous, covering a vast underground complex that includes the famous Terracotta Army. Ancient texts describe rivers of mercury flowing within the tomb, miniature palaces, and elaborate traps meant to protect the emperor in death. Modern soil analysis has confirmed unusually high mercury levels in the area, lending credibility to these descriptions. And yet, the pyramid itself remained visually understated. Over centuries, erosion softened its angles. Vegetation took hold. Trees were planted deliberately. both to stabilize the soil and to align with principles of feng shui. Farming occurred nearby. Roads were built. Villages grew. The structure remained, but its identity faded into the landscape. From ground level, it looks like a hill. From the air, the geometry becomes undeniable. Satellite imagery and aerial photography now clearly show that the region contains dozens of pyramid-shaped burial mounds, carefully aligned and deliberately placed. Some are modest, others are immense. They form an entire funerary landscape rather than isolated monuments. The White Pyramid is not unique. It is part of a system. This realization forces a shift in perspective. These pyramids were not meant to dominate the skyline. They were meant to integrate with it. Chinese imperial philosophy emphasized harmony between human construction and natural form. A tomb that overwhelmed the land would have been seen as disruptive rather than powerful. Power was expressed through control beneath the surface, not spectacle above it. This explains why the pyramids could exist for centuries without attracting the same attention as their Egyptian counterparts. They were not built to impress distant observers. They were built to satisfy cosmic order, lineage, and ritual continuity. Another reason for their obscurity lies in access. Large areas of Shanxi province were restricted for much of the 20th century due to political and military considerations. Archaeological work focused on preservation rather than excavation. Many tombs remain sealed to this day, intentionally left untouched to avoid damage to their contents. Without excavation, there were no dramatic discoveries to capture global attention. The pyramids stayed quiet. Western skepticism also played a role. Early reports of a white pyramid sounded exaggerated, especially when filtered through wartime anecdotes. Without photographs or measurements, the claims were dismissed as misidentification or imagination. Only later did satellite imagery confirm that something substantial had been there all along. The irony is difficult to ignore. The pyramids were not hidden. They were overlooked. This raises an important question about how history is perceived. What we notice often depends less on what exists and more on what we expect to exist. When expectations are narrow, entire categories of evidence can pass unnoticed even when they are visible. The White Pyramid challenges the idea that monumental architecture always announces itself. It shows that some civilizations chose endurance over visibility, integration over dominance. Even today, the interior of many Chinese pyramids remains unexplored. Advanced technology could reveal their contents, but preservation concerns and cultural respect have slowed intervention. This means that much of what lies beneath remains theoretical. From a scientific standpoint, this is frustrating. From a cultural standpoint, it is deliberate. The tombs were meant to remain sealed. Standing above one of these pyramids today, there's little sense of drama. There's no polished stone casing, no towering silhouette. There is earth, vegetation, and quiet continuity. And yet, beneath that surface lies one of the most ambitious burial projects ever undertaken. The pyramid does not demand attention. It waits. This waiting is part of the design. As this chapter closes, the White Pyramid stands as a lesson in perspective. Not all mysteries are hidden because they are secret. Some are hidden because they blend too well into the world around them. History did not erase these pyramids. It walked past them. And only when we learned to look from above did we realize how much had been standing there the entire time. The knowledge that was never meant to survive. When we imagine ancient knowledge being lost, we often picture accidents. Fires consuming libraries, floods washing away archives, or wars destroying cities and their records. But not all lost knowledge disappears by chance. Some knowledge vanishes because it is deliberately removed, suppressed, restricted, or allowed to decay quietly once it becomes inconvenient. This chapter is not about a single book or a single culture. It is about a pattern that repeats across civilizations, a pattern in which certain ideas survive only in fragments because they were never meant to outlive the systems that produced them. Throughout history, writing has been power. Whoever controls what is written controls what can be remembered. But control does not always mean preservation. In many cases, the most dangerous ideas were the ones most carefully erased, not violently destroyed, but quietly excluded from copying, teaching, and transmission. This is how knowledge truly dies. Ancient libraries were not neutral repositories. They were curated spaces. Scribes chose what to copy. Teachers chose what to pass on. Authorities decided which texts were acceptable, useful, or safe. A text that was not copied did not need to be burned. It simply needed to be ignored. Over time, ignorance does the rest. Many ancient manuscripts survived not because they were valued universally, but because they were tolerated long enough to be copied again and again. Religious texts survived because institutions protected them. Legal codes survived because governments relied on them. Philosophical works survived because they aligned with dominant schools of thought. Other texts were not so fortunate. Across the ancient world, references appear to books we no longer possess. Greek writers mention entire works that vanished completely. Roman authors referred to technical manuals that were never preserved. Early Christian scholars describe heretical texts they actively worked to suppress. Islamic historians record scientific and philosophical works that were lost when political priorities shifted. What unites these losses is not accident, but selectivity. Consider ancient scientific knowledge. Astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and engineering were not always welcomed. Some knowledge challenged religious authority. Some contradicted accepted cosmology. Some threatened political control. When that happened, preservation stopped. The Library of Alexandria is often cited as the greatest loss of ancient knowledge, but its destruction is misunderstood. It was not a single catastrophic event. It was a long decline. Scrolls were lost when funding ended. Knowledge faded when copying stopped. Silence replaced memory. This slow disappearance is harder to detect than fire. Forbidden knowledge often leaves subtle traces, quotations without originals, summaries without sources, critiques of ideas whose full form no longer exists. When we read ancient authors arguing against something we cannot read ourselves, we are seeing the shadow of a lost text. This is especially clear in early religious history. Church councils determined which texts were canonical and which were dangerous. Gospels, cosmologies, and interpretations that conflicted with emerging doctrine were labeled heretical. Some were destroyed. Others were hidden. A few survived by accident, buried in deserts or sealed in jars. The Nag Hammadi texts survived because someone hid them, not because they were approved. The same pattern appears outside religion. In imperial systems, technical knowledge was often restricted. Certain methods were kept within guilds. Certain calculations were not taught widely. Some engineering knowledge existed only in practice, passed orally, never written down. This makes that knowledge extremely vulnerable. When the social structure collapses, oral knowledge vanishes instantly. There's no archive to recover, no manuscript to rediscover. The technique disappears with the people who practiced it. This is likely why some ancient construction methods appear suddenly and then disappear without explanation. The knowledge was never intended to persist beyond a specific group or era. Secrecy was a form of control. In some cases, secrecy was religious. In others, it was political. In others, it was practical. Knowledge gives advantage. Advantage invites competition. Restriction reduces risk. But restriction also guarantees loss. There's also the issue of danger. Some ancient texts may have been seen as harmful. Medical knowledge can kill if misused. Astronomical predictions can destabilize societies. Philosophical ideas can undermine authority. Knowledge is not neutral when power depends on belief. Suppressing ideas is easier than debating them. This creates a historical illusion. We assume ancient people believed what survived in writing. In reality, they believed many things that did not survive. What we read is not the whole mind of the past. It is the approved portion. This has consequences for modern understanding. When archaeologists and historians attempt to reconstruct ancient thought, they work with incomplete data. Gaps are filled with assumptions. Missing texts are treated as if they never existed. But absence is not evidence of ignorance. It is evidence of selection. The survival of forbidden manuscripts often depends on accident. A cave collapse, a buried jar, a forgotten monastery. When these texts resurface, they feel shocking not because they are new, but because they disrupt a narrative built on partial information. They reveal alternatives that once existed. The fact that some knowledge was never meant to survive does not mean it was false. It means it was dangerous, inconvenient, or unnecessary to preserve. This raises an uncomfortable question. How much of what we consider ancient belief is actually ancient consensus, and how much is simply what remained after? Everything else was filtered out. The past did not speak with one voice. It argued, experimented, contradicted itself. Most of those arguments are gone. What survives often reflects stability rather than truth. Ideas that supported continuity were copied. Ideas that caused friction were allowed to fade. From a human perspective, this is understandable. Societies protect themselves. They choose coherence over complexity. But for history, it creates distortion. The knowledge that was never meant to survive often survives only as rumor, accusation, or warning. Dangerous ideas, false teachings, forbidden practices. Without the original texts, we cannot judge these claims fairly. We inherit the verdict, not the evidence. This makes archaeology and historical research an act of humility. Every fragment we uncover reminds us of how much we will never recover, not because it was destroyed violently, but because it was quietly excluded. The loss was procedural. As this chapter closes, the idea of forbidden knowledge becomes less dramatic and more human. Knowledge disappears not because people feared it irrationally, but because systems prioritize stability over curiosity. What survives is what was allowed, and what was allowed tells us as much about ancient power as it does about ancient truth. Some knowledge was never meant to survive, not because it was wrong, but because it asked questions that could not be safely answered. And those questions, once silenced, leave behind a past that feels simpler than it ever truly was. The city abandoned without signs of war. When the ruins of Mohenjo-daro were first uncovered, archaeologists expected to see the familiar fingerprints of ancient catastrophe, the kind that usually explains why a great city stops being lived in. They looked for evidence of invasion, for burned layers of destruction, for broken fortifications, scattered weapons, or mass graves that would point toward violence or conquest. Instead, what emerged from the soil was something far more difficult to explain. An immense and carefully planned city that appeared to have been left behind quietly, without chaos, without clear conflict, and without the kind of dramatic ending history often assumes must be present. Mohenjo-daro was one of the largest urban centers of the ancient world, flourishing more than 4,000 years ago as part of the Indus Valley Civilization, a society that rivaled Egypt and Mesopotamia in scale and sophistication. The city was not accidental or organic in its layout, but deliberately designed, with straight streets arranged in a grid, standardized brick construction, and one of the most advanced sanitation systems known from antiquity. Nearly every house was connected to covered drains, and wastewater was managed through a citywide system that required long-term planning and maintenance. This level of urban organization suggests stability, cooperation, and civic responsibility on a scale rarely seen so early in human history. What makes Mohenjo-daro so unsettling is that nothing in the archaeological record suggests it fell to war. There are no widespread burn layers that would indicate destruction by fire, no collapsed defensive walls, and no signs of hurried fortification. Weapons are rare, and there's no evidence of large-scale violence embedded in the city's final occupation layers. The human remains found at the site are few relative to the size of the population, and they do not appear in numbers or positions that would suggest massacre or sudden disaster. Instead of chaos, there is absence. This absence forces archaeologists to confront an uncomfortable possibility, that the city was not destroyed, but deliberately abandoned over time. Many buildings show signs of being emptied rather than ruined, and valuable materials do not appear scattered as if people fled suddenly. There is little indication of widespread looting, which often follows conquest or collapse. These details suggest that the inhabitants had time to leave, and that their departure was not marked by panic. One of the most important factors considered in explaining this abandonment is environmental change. The Indus River system was not stable, and geological evidence indicates that rivers feeding the region may have gradually shifted course or weakened over centuries. For a city so dependent on reliable water access, even slow changes in river behavior could have had severe consequences. Repeated flooding may have damaged infrastructure, while periods of reduced rainfall could have undermined agriculture and trade. These kinds of pressures do not destroy a city overnight, but they make continued occupation increasingly impractical. Archaeological evidence shows that parts of Mohenjo-daro were rebuilt multiple times, sometimes raised higher to cope with flooding, which suggests long-term environmental stress rather than sudden collapse. Over time, maintaining such a city may have required more effort than it was worth, especially if populations were already declining or dispersing into smaller settlements that were easier to sustain. Another striking feature of Mohenjo-daro is the absence of obvious royal palaces or monumental tombs. Unlike many contemporary civilizations, there is little evidence of a powerful ruling elite dominating the urban landscape. Public structures exist, such as the Great Bath, but they appear civic rather than royal in nature. This suggests a society organized around collective order rather than centralized authority, which may have influenced how decline was managed. If leadership was decentralized, decisions to relocate or disperse may have been made gradually and collectively, rather than through dramatic political collapse. The undeciphered Indus script deepens the mystery. Without written records that can be read, we lack direct insight into how the inhabitants understood their own situation. We do not know whether they perceived environmental changes as temporary hardship or as a signal to move elsewhere. We cannot read their laws, beliefs, or historical memory. The silence of their writing system leaves us dependent entirely on physical evidence, which speaks quietly and incompletely. Some scholars propose that Mohenjo-daro was not so much abandoned as transformed, with populations shifting away from large urban centers towards smaller, more flexible communities as trade networks weakened and centralized planning became unnecessary. In this view, the civilization did not end in disaster, but in decentralization. The city lost its purpose before it lost its people entirely, becoming an empty shell rather than a battlefield. This interpretation aligns with a lack of trauma in the archaeological record. Cities do not always die violently. Sometimes they fade as priorities change, resources shift, and people adapt to new conditions. Mohenjo-daro may represent one of the earliest examples of an urban society choosing survival over permanence. Standing among its ruins today, the city feels eerily intact, not because it is complete, but because it was never violently undone. Streets remain visible, walls still stand, and drains still run beneath the ground, waiting for water that no longer comes. The silence does not feel imposed. It feels chosen. The true mystery of Mohenjo-daro is not how it was destroyed, but why its people decided to leave such an advanced city behind without leaving us an explanation we can read. It challenges the assumption that civilizations always end through conquest or catastrophe, and reminds us that some of the most profound endings in human history happen quietly, through decisions repeated until a place is no longer lived in. The structure that rewrites human timelines. For a very long time, human history followed a simple and reassuring order. First came hunting and gathering, then agriculture, then permanent settlements, and only after that did humans begin to build large monuments, organize labor, and develop complex belief systems. This sequence appeared logical, and for decades it shaped how archaeologists understood the rise of civilization. Göbekli Tepe did not fit into this order, and in doing so, it forced a fundamental reassessment of what humans were capable of far earlier than anyone expected. Göbekli Tepe is located in southeastern Turkey, on a modest limestone ridge that does not immediately suggest global importance. There's no dramatic mountain peak, no river running through it, and no obvious reason why ancient people would choose this location for something extraordinary. And yet, beneath this hill lay one of the most unsettling archaeological discoveries of the modern era, a monumental complex built more than 11,000 years ago, at a time when humans were supposedly incapable of such organization. The site predates Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years, and the Egyptian pyramids by over 7,000 years. This alone would be remarkable, but the true shock lies in who built it. Göbekli Tepe was constructed by people who, according to every established model, were still hunter-gatherers. They had no agriculture, no domesticated animals, no pottery, and no permanent settlements as traditionally defined. And yet they quarried, carved, transported, and erected massive stone pillars weighing up to 20 tons, arranged them with a geometric precision, and decorated them with detailed reliefs of animals and symbols. These pillars are not crude. They are T-shaped monoliths carved from limestone, standing several meters tall, with smooth surfaces and sharp edges that show deliberate planning and skilled execution. Many are arranged in circular or oval enclosures, with pairs of larger central pillars surrounded by smaller ones, forming a layout that appears intentional rather than experimental. The relief carvings depict foxes, snakes, birds, boars, insects, and abstract symbols, rendered with confidence and consistency across multiple structures. Nothing about this suggests a temporary camp or casual gathering place. It suggests long-term planning, coordinated labor, and shared symbolic meaning. What makes Göbekli Tepe so disruptive is not just its age, but its implications. To build something like this, a society must be able to organize large groups of people, feed them, motivate them, and coordinate their efforts over extended periods. This level of cooperation was previously believed to emerge only after agriculture created food surpluses. Göbekli Tepe suggests the opposite, that large-scale ritual and belief may have come first, and that agriculture may have developed later as a response to the need to support these gatherings. In other words, humans may not have settled down to farm and then developed religion. They may have gathered for ritual first and then needed farming to sustain it. This reverses a foundational assumption. There's no evidence of domestic housing at Göbekli Tepe, no hearths, no storage pits, no signs of daily life. The site appears to have been used exclusively for ceremonial purposes. People came here, participated in activities we can only infer, and then left. The builders did not live among the structures they created. Even more puzzling is what happened next. After centuries of use, the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were deliberately buried, not destroyed, not abandoned to erosion, but carefully filled in with soil, stone fragments, and debris. This burial preserved the site remarkably well, but it also raises an uncomfortable question. Why would people invest enormous effort to create these structures, only to intentionally bury them? The burial does not appear accidental. It was systematic. The builders closed their own monuments. One possibility is ritual closure, a practice seen in later cultures where sacred spaces are decommissioned according to belief systems. Another is that social structures changed, and the site lost its meaning. But whatever the reason, the act was intentional, suggesting a level of long-term planning that extends beyond construction. The more Göbekli Tepe is studied, the more it resists simple explanation. The symbols carved into the pillars do not match known writing systems, but they are too consistent to be random. Some researchers interpret them as mythological narratives, others as cosmological symbols, and others as clan or totemic markers. None of these interpretations can be confirmed with certainty. What can be confirmed is that the builders shared a symbolic language. This implies communication, tradition, and transmission of ideas across generations, all without writing, agriculture, or cities. It suggests that cognitive and social complexity emerged far earlier than material complexity. From a human perspective, this is deeply unsettling because it collapses the distance we like to place between ourselves and early humans. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not primitive in thought. They were not waiting for civilization to begin. They were already capable of abstract belief, cooperation, and monumental ambition. The timeline did not break. Our assumptions did. Göbekli Tepe forces us to accept that history is not a straight ladder of progress. It is a web of developments that can emerge in unexpected orders. Belief can precede farming. Organization can precede cities. Monumentality can precede permanence. This realization changes how we interpret other ancient sites. If humans could build Göbekli Tepe 11,000 years ago, then other unexplained structures around the world deserve reconsideration. The question is no longer whether ancient people were capable, but whether we have underestimated them because we expected them to behave according to our models. As excavation continues, new enclosures are still being uncovered, suggesting that what we see today is only a fraction of the original complex. The scale may be far larger than initially assumed, and yet, despite its importance, much of Göbekli Tepe remains unexcavated, protected for future study. The site does not give up its secrets easily. Standing on the hill today, surrounded by quiet countryside, it is difficult to reconcile the peaceful landscape with the implications beneath your feet. This place does not announce itself as revolutionary. It simply exists, forcing historians to rewrite timelines not because it demands attention, but because it refuses to fit into the story we told ourselves. Göbekli Tepe does not tell us when civilization began. It tells us that civilization is the wrong word. Humans were complex long before they were settled, organized long before they were agricultural, and capable of meaning long before they left written records. This structure does not add a chapter to history. It rearranges the book, and in doing so, it leaves us with a quieter, more difficult understanding of the past, one in which human potential was present far earlier than we ever expected, waiting patiently beneath the soil until someone was ready to listen. The mystery that modern technology cannot solve. In the modern world, there is a deep and often unspoken confidence that technology eventually solves every problem. Satellites map the planet, ground penetrating radar sees beneath the surface, LiDAR strips away forests to reveal lost cities, and laboratory techniques can date organic material with astonishing precision. Because of this, there's a widespread assumption that ancient mysteries persist only because we have not looked closely enough yet. And yet, despite all of this technological power, there are still questions from the ancient world that remain stubbornly unresolved, not because we lack data, but because the data refuses to lead to clear answers. Archaeology today is more advanced than at any other point in history. LiDAR has revealed entire cities hidden beneath jungles, exposing road networks, terraces, and urban planning that were invisible from the ground. Satellite imagery has identified ancient structures in deserts, mountains, and remote plains. Chemical analysis can identify the origin of stone, metal, and pigment. DNA sequencing can trace ancestry across continents. In theory, nothing should remain truly unknowable. In practice, many of the most important mysteries remain exactly that. One reason is that technology does not replace context. It can show us what exists, but not always why it exists or how it was used. LiDAR can reveal the outline of a buried structure, but it cannot explain its purpose. Radiocarbon dating can tell us when something was built, but not what it meant to the people who built it. Even the most detailed scans cannot reconstruct belief, intention, or social organization with certainty. This becomes especially clear when technology reveals complexity without explanation. Across the world, LiDAR surveys have uncovered massive earthworks, geometric patterns, and urban layouts that do not match known cultural models. In the Amazon basin, entire networks of settlements were revealed that challenged the idea that the region was sparsely populated before European contact. In Southeast Asia, LiDAR has shown that temple complexes extended far beyond their visible cores. In Central America, dense urban landscapes emerged beneath tree cover, forcing historians to revise population estimates dramatically. These discoveries answered some questions while creating new ones. Technology revealed that these civilizations were larger and more complex than previously thought, but it did not explain how they organized themselves, why they declined, or what social mechanisms sustained them. In many cases, the written record is absent or undeciphered, leaving technology to illuminate structures without voices. Another limitation lies in preservation. Not all materials survive equally. Stone endures. Organic materials decay. Entire aspects of ancient life were built from wood, fiber, leather, and plant matter that leave little trace after thousands of years. Technology cannot scan what no longer exists. This creates a distorted picture of the past. We see stone monuments and assume stone defined those cultures, when in reality stone may have been only the durable fraction of a much broader material world. Tools, scaffolding, textiles, symbols, and everyday objects may have played crucial roles but vanished completely. Modern technology cannot recover what time has erased. There is also the problem of intent. Advanced tools can measure alignment, orientation, and construction technique, but they cannot definitively determine purpose. Astronomical alignments can be identified, but whether they were symbolic, practical, ritual, or coincidental often remains debated. Precision does not automatically imply advanced science. It may reflect tradition, ritual repetition, or symbolic importance rather than calculation. Technology provides numbers. Interpretation remains human. Even when data is abundant, consensus can remain elusive. Different researchers, using the same scans and measurements, often arrive at different conclusions based on theoretical frameworks, cultural assumptions, and disciplinary boundaries. Technology does not eliminate disagreement. It often sharpens it. There are also cases where technology deepens mystery, rather than resolving it. At some sites, scans reveal construction techniques that do not match known tools. Stone surfaces appear shaped in ways that are difficult to replicate experimentally. Transport routes for massive stones remain unclear even when terrain is mapped in detail. In these cases, technology confirms the difficulty rather than explaining it away. The problem is not that ancient people did something impossible. The problem is that we do not understand the systems they used. Technology is excellent at isolating components. Ancient societies operated as systems. Labor organization, seasonal cycles, Belief structures and long-term planning interacted in ways that do not leave direct physical signatures. Without understanding those systems, even the best data remains incomplete. Another challenge is scale. Archaeology often focuses on sites in isolation, while ancient people experienced landscapes as connected networks. Roads, pilgrimage routes, trade paths, and seasonal movement patterns are difficult to reconstruct fully, even with satellite coverage. What looks mysterious in isolation may make sense within a broader context that no longer survives. Technology also depends on interpretation pipelines. Raw data must be processed, filtered, and modeled. Choices made during this process shape results. What is highlighted, what is ignored, and what is categorized as noise all influence conclusions. In this sense, technology does not remove human bias. It reframes it. Perhaps the most uncomfortable truth is that some mysteries persist because they challenge foundational assumptions. When evidence does not fit accepted models, it is often described as anomalous rather than transformative. Technology can identify anomalies, but it cannot force paradigm shifts. Those occur slowly, through debate, resistance, and generational change. Göbekli Tepe did not rewrite history because of technology alone. It rewrote history because scholars were willing to reconsider long-held assumptions. Without that willingness, data remains inert. From a human perspective, this reveals something important. The limits we encounter are not always technical. They are conceptual. We reach the edge of understanding not because our tools fail, but because our frameworks do. Modern technology excels at revealing complexity. Meaning is harder. The burial hidden for cultural reasons, not time. When people think about lost burials or undiscovered tombs, they usually imagine erosion, collapse, looting, or the simple passage of time as the reason these places remain hidden. In many cases, however, the absence of a burial has nothing to do with age or chance. Some graves are not lost at all. They are known, remembered, and deliberately left untouched because the cultures connected to them believe they should never be opened. These burials are hidden not by soil or stone, but by respect, taboo, and living tradition. Archaeology often operates under the assumption that uncovering the past is inherently valuable, but this assumption does not hold universally. For many cultures, especially indigenous and traditionally rooted societies, burial sites are not historical data points. They are sacred spaces tied to identity, ancestry, and spiritual continuity. Disturbing them is not seen as discovery, but as violation. This creates a tension that modern technology cannot resolve. There are burial sites around the world whose approximate locations are known through oral history, cultural memory, or historical record, yet excavation is prohibited. These sites are protected not by law alone, but by belief systems that remain active today. In these cases, archaeology reaches a boundary where curiosity must yield to consent. One of the clearest examples is the burial of Genghis Khan. Historical accounts describe how his funeral procession killed anyone who witnessed it, and how the soldiers involved were themselves killed afterward to preserve secrecy. Horses were reportedly driven over the burial site to erase traces. While some of these details may be exaggerated, the core idea remains consistent across Mongolian tradition. The burial location is meant to remain unknown forever. More importantly, modern Mongolian culture largely supports this secrecy. The burial is considered sacred, and excavation is viewed as deeply disrespectful. Even if technology could identify the exact location, there is little appetite to confirm it physically. In this case, the burial is hidden not because it cannot be found, but because it should not be found. Similar situations exist across the world. In parts of Australia, Aboriginal burial sites are protected through cultural law. Locations may be known to elders but are withheld from researchers. Excavation is forbidden not because of legal technicalities, but because disturbing ancestral remains is believed to disrupt spiritual balance. In North America, indigenous communities have long resisted excavation of burial mounds and graves. For decades, archaeologists treated these sites as scientific resources, often removing remains without consent. This caused profound harm and led to the eventual creation of repatriation laws. Today, many known burial sites remain unexcavated by agreement, not ignorance. In these cases, archaeology does not lack information, it lacks permission. This distinction matters deeply. Technology could scan beneath the ground, map structures, and estimate contents without touching the site. But even non-invasive methods can be considered intrusive if they violate cultural boundaries. For many communities, knowing is not neutral. Knowing can itself be a form of disturbance. This challenges a core assumption of modern research that observation without contact is harmless. In some cultural frameworks, observation is interaction, and interaction has consequences. There are also burials hidden deliberately within religious contexts. In some traditions, the exact locations of saints, leaders, or sacred figures are intentionally obscured to prevent pilgrimage from becoming idol worship. In others, secrecy protects sites from desecration or political exploitation. In these cases, burial secrecy is a form of preservation. What makes these hidden burials especially difficult for historians is that they sit at the intersection of past and present. They are not relics of extinct cultures, they belong to living ones. This means their treatment is governed not only by evidence, but by ethics. Modern archaeology has begun to recognize this boundary, but not without resistance. For much of its history, the discipline operated under colonial assumptions, treating all ancient remains as open to study, regardless of cultural context. That approach is now increasingly questioned. The result is a category of mystery that will likely remain unresolved indefinitely, not because answers are impossible, but because they are not ours to take. This forces a reframing of what it means to understand the past. Knowledge is not always about extraction. Sometimes it's about restraint. Choosing not to dig can be as meaningful as choosing to excavate. From a historical perspective, this creates gaps that cannot be filled by future technology. No satellite, scan, or algorithm can replace consent. No advancement will override belief systems that actively protect certain sites. And perhaps that is not a failure. These burials remind us that history is not only a record of what happened, but of how people choose to remember. Silence in this context is intentional. It is part of the meaning. The modern impulse to uncover everything assumes that preservation requires exposure. Many cultures disagree. For them, preservation means leaving something exactly where it is, unseen and untouched. As this chapter closes, the idea of hidden burials takes on a different tone. These are not mysteries waiting to be solved. They are boundaries being maintained. They tell us that the past is not inert, and that some parts of it remain protected by living values rather than forgotten by time. The burial is hidden not because history lost it. It is hidden because history decided to keep it. The tomb that was sealed before anyone was buried. Across the ancient world, tombs were among the most carefully planned structures ever built. They were designed for permanence, ritual precision, and continuity between life and death. Kings, nobles, and elites invested enormous resources into preparing these spaces long before death arrived. Because of this, archaeologists generally expect tombs to contain what they were built for: a body, grave goods, inscriptions, or at the very least, signs that burial once took place. And yet, in multiple ancient cultures, there are tombs that were completed, sealed, and left empty, as if the final act they were designed for never happened. These are not looted tombs. They are not destroyed tombs. They are tombs that appear to have never been used. What makes these structures unsettling is the clarity of intent behind them. They were not abandoned halfway through construction. Their walls were finished. Their passages were closed. In some cases, sealing mechanisms were activated exactly as they would be for a burial, and then nothing followed. The tomb existed without the dead. One of the most striking examples comes from ancient Egypt, where tombs were often prepared years or decades in advance. Some tombs in the Valley of the Kings and surrounding necropolises show clear signs of being fully carved, decorated, and sealed, yet contain no mummy and no evidence that one was ever placed inside. Burial chambers are empty. Sarcophagi are missing or unused. Ritual spaces show no signs of final funerary rites. This presents a problem for interpretation. If a tomb was robbed, there are usually clues: broken seals, disturbed debris, tool marks, or disordered remains. In empty tombs, these signs are absent. The space is intact. The emptiness appears intentional rather than the result of intrusion. One possible explanation is death elsewhere. If an individual died far from home, their body may never have been recovered. In such cases, the tomb might still be sealed for ritual reasons, even without the remains. In many belief systems, sealing the tomb completed a symbolic process, regardless of physical presence. But this explanation does not fit all cases. Some empty tombs were prepared for powerful individuals whose deaths were well documented. Others belonged to rulers whose reigns were brief or politically unstable. In these situations, the absence of burial may reflect sudden changes in power, legitimacy, or belief. A ruler could fall out of favor before death. A dynasty could collapse. Religious practices could shift. A tomb prepared under one ideology might become inappropriate under another. Rather than repurpose or destroy the tomb, it may have been sealed and abandoned. This approach preserved order without honoring the original intent. There is also the possibility of ritual transformation. In some ancient traditions, tombs served symbolic functions beyond burial. They were portals, markers, or sacred spaces tied to cosmology rather than individual bodies. In these contexts, sealing a tomb could have meaning independent of death. The structure mattered more than the occupant. Archaeology struggles with this idea because it contradicts functional expectations. Modern thinking tends to associate architecture with direct use. Ancient societies often embedded symbolic meaning into space itself. A completed tomb could fulfill a ritual purpose even if no body ever entered it. Another explanation lies in crisis. Plague, political upheaval, or sudden environmental disaster could interrupt burial plans. If normal funerary procedures were disrupted, sealing a tomb might have been a way to close an unfinished chapter rather than leave it open. Closure mattered. What complicates interpretation further is that some empty tombs show evidence of great care. Seals were placed correctly, entrances were blocked methodically, decorative elements were completed. This suggests that the act of sealing was deliberate and meaningful, not an afterthought. In other words, someone chose to finish the tomb without finishing the burial. This choice tells us something important about ancient priorities. The integrity of ritual and architecture may have been more important than the physical presence of remains. Order was preserved even when circumstance changed. There's also a political dimension. Tombs were statements of power. Leaving one open could invite speculation, instability, or desecration. Sealing an empty tomb maintained the appearance of continuity, even if reality was more complicated. Silence can be strategic. From a modern perspective, empty tombs feel unresolved. They seem like mistakes or failures. For the people who sealed them, they may have represented the least disruptive option in a disrupted world. Archaeologists are left with a space that refuses to tell a complete story. There's architecture without biography, preparation without fulfillment, intention without outcome. This challenges how we interpret absence. An empty tomb is not evidence of nothing happening. It is evidence that something did not happen as planned, and that the response to that failure was deliberate. The tomb was not forgotten. It was closed. As this chapter closes, these sealed but unused tombs remind us that ancient history was not linear or predictable. Plans were made, beliefs shifted, power changed hands, and rituals adapted. Not every monument fulfilled its original purpose, and not every ending followed expectation. Some tombs were sealed before anyone was buried because history intervened, and sealing them was the most orderly way to acknowledge that interruption. The dead never came, but the ritual still ended. And that quiet decision, preserved in stone, remains one of the most human traces the past has left behind.